Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome everybody to today's policy forum on the primacy of politics and the protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping. IPI's research and convening on this topic is part of a larger work stream at IPI on the UN's Action for Peacekeeping Agenda, or 84P+. And I'd like to right away thank the Kingdom of the Netherlands for the generous support that they have provided to this work, and indeed for our long-standing partnership. The Netherlands has been a key partner for IPI on our policy development and programming on the protection of civilians for many years, and we are really deeply grateful for that. Support to political processes and the protection of civilians are two of the most prominent tasks within multidimensional peacekeeping. Over the past 2 decades, POC has grown in scope and focused, prioritized by the Security Council among mandated tasks, and often used as the yardstick to measure mission effectiveness and success. At the same time, member states have continued to reiterate their commitment to the primacy of politics as a reference point for other mission activities. While UN policies and guidance emphasize the need to integrate missions' political and protection work, it is not always clear how to do this in practice. So the purpose of our discussion today of this event is therefore to look more closely at how these two sets of priorities fit together, considering both entry points and barriers for better integration. As part of our discussion today, I'm very happy to announce that we are launching a new IPI report on this topic, on the primacy of politics and the protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping, by IPI Director of Research, Jenna Russo, who will be moderating our discussion, and IPI non-resident advisor Ralph Mamiya, who will be presenting some of the findings. The paper is available on our website, and I really sincerely recommend it highly. In addition to the authors, we have an excellent group of panelists today to discuss this topic and the findings of the report. But before turning it over to the panel, I'd like to first welcome the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the UN, Mark Zellenrath, who will provide further opening remarks. Ambassador, thanks again. Always a pleasure to see you, virtual or otherwise. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Adam, also for your kind words. And we're certainly very proud to have made this possible today, because we've done a couple of these events with IPI together, because it's basically part of our DNA when it comes to peacekeeping and protection of civilians. We've done so since 2018 when we launched Action for Peacekeeping. We did it a year ago when we had Action for Peacekeeping Plus. And while I was reading through the report, and I just want to give a huge shout out to Jenna and Ralph for the way they wrote it. It's really concise, it's short, it's practical. And I thought, what an opportune moment, because we're currently in C-34 negotiations, as you are probably all aware. And of course, protection is part of C-34. And I think there are many things in this report that can feed directly into that process, because not only does it, of course, have a couple of recommendations for mission leaderships and for the UN in general, but also for member states. So while I was reading through it, I thought, there are a couple of things that we could really take away when it comes to C-34 and what we're negotiating there in the next couple of months. And from my point of view, at least, I think it's the practicalities that stand out when it comes to the in-mission trainings and the pre-deployment trainings, when it comes to protection of civilians, really feeding it into the core makeup of a mission, and also when we're talking about the political circumstances in which a mission operates, which of course has not gotten any easier over the last couple of years. I really enjoy how you call for this proactive approach when it comes to protection of civilians, the engagement that goes with it, and the thought to be put into it before deployment and during deployment as well. And I think it really underlines that protection of civilians isn't a singular topic. It's not a small little piece that is carved out in a mission. It's really an integrated part of the whole mission, of the planning, of the execution, and in which member states should think about it. So again, thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Adam, for getting us together today, especially now in the context of C34. And I certainly wish you all a very fruitful discussion. I will have to leave somewhere halfway through, but I'll be listening with great interest. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. Very, very appreciative of your remarks. I'll now quickly turn it over to IPI Director of Research and Head of the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations, Dr. Jenna Russo, who will moderate our discussion. Jenna, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Adam. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us today and for our panelists. We're so happy to welcome you here. As Adam mentioned, the purpose of our time here today is to be discussing the relationship between the protection of civilians and the so-called primacy of politics in UN peacekeeping settings. And while both of these sets of priorities have been elevated by member states in the Security Council, it's not always clear how to integrate them in planning and operations. And as Adam mentioned, as part of our event, we're very happy to be launching the new report we have on this, which I had the pleasure of co-authoring with Ralph Mamiya, who will speak in just a moment. I believe we put the link in the chat, and we encourage everyone to have a look at it. We're very grateful for our panel of speakers that are joining us here today, and please allow me to introduce each of our guests. First, we have Ralph Mamiya, who is a non-resident advisor at IPI. Ralph is the former team leader of the POC team for DPKO and DFS, and he spent more than 10 years working on peacekeeping and protection issues, including tours with the UN missions in Sudan and South Sudan. Next, we have Regina Fitzpatrick, who is the team leader for POC in DPO and DPET. Prior to joining DPET, she's worked on UN human rights investigations in Yemen and spent several years on human rights teams and field offices in the UN missions in Afghanistan and South Sudan. Next, we have Kenny Gluck. Kenny is the former DSRSG for MINUSCA and also spent time working in the Office of the Special Envoy for Yemen. Prior to joining the UN, Kenny worked with several international NGOs providing humanitarian assistance in complex emergencies, including as a director of operations for MSF. And finally, we're very happy to welcome Wendy McClinchy, who is a director of the UN program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Prior to joining Civic, Wendy served in a number of UN field and headquarters-based positions, including in Liberia, Lebanon, the DRC, UNHCR, and in the Office of the Secretary General. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us. In a minute, I'll give the floor to Ralph, who's going to present some of the findings of the report. But first, I also wanted to flag that we will have a time for discussion and Q&A. So already I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post any of the comments and questions you have. Ralph, I'll turn it over to you for an overview of the report. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Thank you, Adam, and many thanks to the ambassador for those very kind words on the report. And this is an important issue, I think, at a time when politics and political engagement have never been more important for the future of peacekeeping. And what we tried to do in this report is to identify a set of issues, identify challenges and opportunities within them, on joining up POC and political strategies, and to make some modest recommendations. So with regard to framing the issue, we felt this was important because when you ask people about the protection of civilians and political processes, you tend to get one of three responses. Some people will say that the protection of civilians gets too much attention and missions have lost sight of political goals. Some people will say that missions emphasize political processes too much, that they chase whatever mediation process is ongoing. And even if experts are telling the mission that parties aren't really committed, and so mission resources are expended on supporting paper agreements rather than protecting civilians. And then you will also hear from people that this is an issue which is a solved problem, that there really is no tension between the protection of civilians and the primacy of politics. And I think it is important to note that on paper and in policy, this is true. It has been true for a very, very long time. I began working on the protection of civilians for DPO 11 years ago. And we were clear then that the protection of civilians was, ultimately in service of peacekeeping, which is a political tool, that there wasn't really daylight between these two concepts. And so at the level of policy, there isn't really debate on this, but practice can be more challenging. There are real tensions between political engagement and protection of civilians' mandates, and these situations force difficult decisions. And that's what this report tries to focus on. I should say that there is value to all of those viewpoints. I don't want to sound dismissive of any of them. Sometimes missions expend too many resources on POC. Sometimes they're too focused on political agreements, and sometimes they really do, find ways to unite them both. And we were looking for lessons from missions and moments in missions when people have found creative solutions. But we also wanted to be clear about what we meant by the primacy of politics and protection of civilians. Both of these can be somewhat slippery terms, and we needed to focus ourselves as well. We focused on mission level political engagement carried out by the SRSG and mission personnel, rather than a broader concept of the primacy of politics as geopolitical strategy, as negotiations between member states, or triangular cooperation between TCCs, the Security Council, and the Secretariat. We also tried to avoid defining the primacy of politics in contrast to alternative descriptions of peacekeeping goals, such as stabilization. And then with regard to the protection of civilians, we understand it as mandate in keeping with DPO policy that is very much in service of larger political goals, that POC is not an end in itself, while also recognizing that the protection of civilians inform strategic objectives in a substantive way. The POC is not just an authorization to use force. It is also a substantive way in which missions shape their activities. Now, regarding I should note that these challenges to joined up work between POC mandates and political mandates is not unique to this dyad. Missions have lots of mandates. They continuously face challenges in making that set of tasks a coherent whole. But the protection of civilians and political engagement, good offices, and mediation have been prominent for so long that we felt that this was a particularly important group of mandates to address. And this report, I should mention, involved extensive interviews with mission staff, former mission leaders, headquarters personnel, and of course, it built on years of research by DPO, by IPI, and by others. So next, I want to catalog a few of the challenges and opportunities we identified. It's just a quick summary, and I think it's still worth reading the full report, but here's a snapshot of what we found. First, a run through of some challenges. Engaging with state perpetrators of violence. This is a much discussed, I think well-known challenge that peacekeeping missions faced, but it was, it's very much a situation at the forefront for missions that have both POC and mandates to really any additional mandate to support state authority, to engage in political processes. And nearly all of our current POC mandated missions face situations where host government security forces face accusations of violence against civilians. Maintaining host state consent and strengthening the mission's political role can be difficult in these circumstances. And the situation is often made more challenging by the fact that mission mandates to extend state authority can be open-ended and ill-defined. Second, it can be difficult to link POC and politics in the absence of a formal political process. This is another situation that's unfortunately common in modern peacekeeping missions. where we often see commitment to ceasefires that is extremely low, but violence and instability that's high and wide-ranging. And in such situations, missions may struggle to find the political role that they're expected to fill. And this can create a wide divergence between a mission's POC and political efforts. And it can create operational momentum that makes it appear that focus is shifting towards POC and away from political engagement. And there was one interviewee that stood out in this regard, and he noted that, and I'll just as for a short direct quote, in the absence of clear civilian vision, the military component view is that the civilian leadership wants them to focus on the protection of civilians. Historically, in the absence of clear direction from civilian leadership, the force does ad hoc allocation of its assets. And this was from someone with extensive experience in peacekeeping, held a fairly senior position, recognizing that where that political element is unclear, there can be a default to action, especially from military personnel. And they often conveyed or categorized that action as the protection of civilians. Now, examples like this highlight what can appear to be a choice to emphasize one mandate over the other is really the result of mission staff trying to do jobs without sufficient direction. Finally, missions sometimes face challenges in linking local political and national strategies. The links between POC and political engagement can actually be more straightforward at the local level, where peacekeepers engage directly with civilian communities and armed actors. But missions sometimes conceive of their political role in national or regional terms. Our report did take an explicitly broad view of politics, considering both the local processes as well as the national ones. But this is not necessarily the norm, and one of our recommendations was to underline that politics should be considered broadly, both at those national or regional level mediation processes, as well as the kind of agreements that can be struck at a very local level. And to move on to some other recommendations and the opportunities that they arise from, there's three here: analysis, planning and strategies, and negotiated agreements. With regards to analysis, missions have made strides in joint analysis, but we think there's room for improvement. In particular, missions have become much more effective integrating operational analysis, but connecting operational analysis to strategic analysis is not always easy. Too often, analytical work that results in a POC strategy and a political strategy is beginning with a different set of analytical assumptions. And greater joint work for components of the missions to develop their respective strategies could enhance coherence. Planning was also important. In a perfect world, the mission concept and mission plan would integrate and divide responsibilities maybe, and we'd never encounter the word silo, we'd never encounter turf battles, but reality can be different. What we found was that strategic planning needs to begin at the top. SRSGs need to take ownership of strategic vision, whether in a mission concept or mission plan, and POC strategies and political strategies should flow from these. And just as important, the overarching political vision should be widely disseminated among mission staff and clearly understood at all levels, in the mission headquarters, in remote field offices, amongst military, police, and civilian colleagues. And we also emphasize in the report the need for joint mission planning cells in all missions. Missions have had strategic planning units for more than a decade, but frequently these have been technical units that tend to focus on budgetary planning. But strategic planning is central to translating strategic vision into operations. This requires empowered strategic planners and a team that joins up personnel from all components, including the military and police. Missions for many years have had joint operations centers, joint mission analysis cells, and joint logistics cells, and these components do exactly that. They bring together civilian, military, and police colleagues to join up on operations, logistics, and analysis. What has been missing there is planning in a similarly integrated way. MINUSMA in Mali has a model of this approach, has had a model of this approach for a few years now, and other missions are considering similar approaches. Finally, missions should continue their work to integrate POC into negotiated agreements. The latest mediation guidance from DPPA highlights the role that mediators can play in advocating for POC and negotiations. This includes advocacy during the lead up to a formal negotiation process, especially in cases where armed groups may ratchet up their use of violence to increase their bargaining position. It also includes leveraging the full range of high-level political actors, including special envoys, regional organizations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the SRSGs for Sexual Violence and Children Armed Conflict, and special advisors on R2P and genocide. So in sum, we tried to focus on a small set of practical recommendations to address what really is a complex and long-standing challenge. And I think this really is a hugely important topic at this moment. Many of us are thinking about the future of peacekeeping in a changing world, but at the same time, we need to be supportive of the thousands of men and women who are in missions right now. Their jobs have never been more important, but the challenges they face have never been greater. And we hope that they find something useful in this report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for that overview of the report. And I think a lot to discuss, and very happy to turn to our panelists before opening to the Q&A. So Regina, I'd like to turn to you first. As Ralph mentioned, UN policies and guidance already reference the importance of linking POC and mission political strategies, but this is not always operationalized at the field level within missions. From the POC perspective, can you discuss a bit about why it's important for POC to be integrated throughout mission planning and operations, and what you see as opportunities and some of the barriers for doing this better?
Sure, thank you, Jenna, and thank you to IPI and to the Kingdom of the Netherlands for hosting this event and for inviting me. Congratulations also to Jenna and Ralph on the report. As you say, and in the report and already here, this is not a new topic. It's something we've been struggling to implement, the relationship between POC and politics, despite strong conceptual agreement and policy language. I'd mentioned just the tier 1 of our POC concept in peacekeeping, protection through dialogue and engagement, already reinforces the primacy of politics in the resolution of conflict and the role of peacekeeping in the pursuit of sustainable solutions. And as you mentioned, we're clear that political and POC strategies need to be mutually reinforcing. But so beginning with this issue of why is this important? Why does POC need to be integrated throughout mission planning and operations, including political strategies and plans? And the first reason is for those plans and operations to be successful and sustainable. Just as sustainable protection can only be achieved by addressing the drivers of violence via political solution, sustainable peace can only be achieved by ensuring protection is a central consideration in political solutions. I think that we know enough by now about cycles of violence to appreciate that violence will recur if the population or parts of the population continues to feel at risk. And then the second reason is because it's the right thing to do. And I say that simply because it is simple. Peacekeeping may have other purposes than POC, but as the Secretary General's call to action for human rights makes clear, in the United Nations, protection must underpin all action. And our peacekeepers, the vast majority of them, know this in their bones. It's why they're out there, and their dedication to POC is remarkable. So with this in mind, I wanted to focus my remarks on 3 elements, all of which are covered in the report, some of which Ralph's already mentioned, and all of which are intertwined. And those are leadership, strategies, and local level engagement. It cannot be overstated how critical leadership is in getting this right. At all levels, but beginning at the top with SRSGs, DSRSGs, these are usually political players. They're selected for their political acumen, and are often actively involved in political engagement with elites at the national level. So these leaders have to have an appreciation for the need to integrate POC into those political approaches. So what can we collectively do to ensure that these leaders are alive to protection? First, it should be considered in the criteria for selection for mission leadership roles. Not that they be protection specialists per se, but that they appreciate the strategic priority of POC and the necessity of addressing protection concerns to reach durable political solutions. But mission leaders aren't expected to do this on their own. That's precisely why we have POC advisors. These personnel do need to be technical protection experts, not because they're responsible for implementing the POC mandate, but so that they can provide that technical expertise to mission leadership. Their primary roles are advice and coordination. Unfortunately, in some missions, these posts have been left vacant for long stretches, or sometimes even repurposed to fill other needs. Without effective POC advisors, it is unrealistic to expect that mission leadership, who have vast responsibilities, will get protection right. And to be effective, POC advisors need appropriate access to mission leadership and to the rooms where it happens. While each mission is different, our practice has generally shown that the post of the POC advisor should be placed in the office of the SRSG. POC advisors may need additional capacity building and support to lead up, as the report calls this work, to influence high-level strategy and decision-making. And finally, strong leaders don't only do something themselves or even require it of those whom they lead. They inspire. And peacekeepers today are hungry for leaders who prioritize POC and who can lead them to have a positive impact on the lives of the populations they're deployed to serve. On strategies, mission POC strategies have been a requirement in the POC policy for many years now. And in the POC handbook, we have a section dedicated to POC strategies. Among the critical elements of an effective POC strategy is prioritization of threats and of responses. An integrated assessment and prioritization will form the basis of the mission's strategic approach to POC and guide the use of mission resources for POC. And this POC strategy needs to be a living document. It can't just sit on the shelf for years and collect dust. It should be reviewed annually following the mandate renewal and revised and updated as necessary. It should also be reviewed and revised in response to changes in the operating context. This doesn't necessarily need to be an onerous process each time. If POC is alive and well in the mission with an integrated and comprehensive approach, it should be a relatively light and organic process, but it is necessary. And yet this is not the reality in most of our missions today, unfortunately. To have updated POC strategies that reflect current conditions and priorities and are well socialized and implemented throughout the missions. We're currently working to support missions on this. For example, UNMISS is currently updating its POC strategy that dates back to 2014. But even the strongest POC strategy can't exist in isolation. It must be integrated into all other mission planning documents. And critically, as we've said, it must be mutually reinforcing with the mission's overall political strategy. The mission's POC efforts should contribute to the pursuit of an inclusive and sustainable peace, and the mission's political efforts should contribute to the protection of civilians from physical violence. So how do we improve this in practice? To begin with, it has to be addressed from the top through clear messaging on and operationalization of the linkages between politics and protection. And then it also requires greater efforts at coordination. Actively engaging political affairs colleagues in the POC strategy development and review process is important, as well as seeking their regular input into POC threat assessments and response planning. Where POC advisors are not in a position to affect this themselves, an integrated function, like those Ralph mentioned, the JOC, the JMAC, or an integrated strategic planning unit could facilitate this. Which brings me finally to local level engagement. I couldn't agree more with the report's suggestion that we need to broaden our concept of the political beyond the process of getting national elites to sit at a table and sign a document. The political also includes formal and informal processes at the local level. And as the report finds, all of this seems to work better at the local level. At the field office level of peacekeeping, POC and political processes are often understood as being inextricably linked, and mission plans and operations reflect this. And beyond that, field level mission personnel also more often view POC as central to their work compared to their mission headquarters colleagues. For example, the report contrasts civil affairs officers and political affairs officers in this regard. So I think there are a few things behind this. First, at field office level, peacekeepers are much more engaged with the local population. Most of the work in Mission HQ is internal, or at least focused on international actors and partners or engagement with elites. In contrast, in field offices, peacekeepers are much more outward facing, engaging with local authorities, but also community groups, civil society, and vulnerable populations, for example, while they're on patrols or on field missions. Second, the work setting at field office level, which is often limited to a single small base, means that engagement between mission personnel and across components is more frequent and regular. And this facilitates a common analysis and coordinated planning and actions. And third, I think it comes back to leadership. Heads of field offices have proven adept at this, whether by virtue of their skill sets or their operating environments or both. And I think it would be worth interrogating this a bit more to see what we can learn from the field office level and how it might be transferable to mission headquarters if it can. In any event, we are generally more effective at integrating POC and politics at the field office level. In some cases, particularly where national political processes are stalled and violence continues, this may be our best opportunity for political impact. In spaces where the mission has no clear role in the formal political process, it may be our only opportunity. Ideally, the local level dynamics are linked to those at the national level, and we've seen some success with this in all of our larger missions, though our efforts must continue. So all of this is not to say that reconciling POC and politics is easy, but nothing in peacekeeping is easy. We're not in this line of work for easy. With strong leadership, clear strategies and guidance, and a continued commitment, we'll see the fruits of this labor. We can't expect it to look like a single overarching peace agreement that immediately silences all the guns and ushers in an era of stability, prosperity, and equality. But it will contribute day by day to inclusive and sustainable solutions at various levels among various actors, and it will improve the lives of civilians affected by armed conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina. And just to echo, the idea of integrating POC and the political, it's not integration for the sake of integration, but it's because we understand them as mutually reinforcing processes where sustainable protection can only be achieved by promoting political solutions and political interpreted as broadly. And also because protecting civilians can create a more enabling environment for peace to take place. And this is one of the things that we talk about. And I'm also hoping we can come back to the really important point of leadership, which is something that came up a lot for us, the real importance of mission leadership in this process. And so because of that, I'm very happy to get to turn to Kenny next. Kenny, as a former mission leader, I'd like it if you could discuss a bit about how you understood POC as part of the mission's strategic approach in Central African Republic. And in addition, if you can discuss a bit about the different types of planning processes that you use in MINUSCA to help and create and share a single strategic vision that could guide other areas of mission work, including the mission's political and POC objectives. So Kenny, over to you. Thanks. Hope you're on mute.
Thank you very much to the Netherlands and to IPI for organizing this, and congratulations to Jenna and Ralph for a report, because I think it's excellent to see two strands which have often been conceived of and operationalized in parallel. It's very good to see them brought together. Like Regina said, there's always been emphasis in the policy documents of the linkages between the two. But in the many missions I have been into, there has been a real struggle to turn this into practical, practical approaches. So I think this mission should hopefully help provide ideas on how political tools can be used more effectively to reduce violence against civilians, and how the reduction of violence against civilians can orient the primacy of politics. I'm certainly one of the people, like Ralph referred to, who said, if you're seeing any daylight, I think you probably have a real strategic failure. Political engagement is not, the agreements exist for civilians. Agreements, political agreements, they exist in order to reduce civilians. If they're not doing that, we have a real problem. In our work in MINUSCA, certainly using political tools in addition to more traditional POC tools in order to reduce violence was at the heart of the mission strategy. There wasn't a political strategy, there was a mission strategy, and POC is one of the clear objectives in it. There were two analytic factors that for us drove the alignment of POC and the rest of the mission strategy. One is that CAR is in some ways a constant demonstration of the limits of national agreements. As most Central Africans complained when they had the latest agreement, it was the 8th agreement in 6 years. And none of them had changed fundamentally the dynamics of violence. In the wake of many of them, violence against civilians increased. And that just demonstrates that primacy of politics limited to the search for national agreements is very lacking. Very happy to see that come back in the report very clearly. The armed groups that were signatories to agreements that were active in the Central African Republic were all insufficiently cohesive or structured to effectively negotiate, and certainly to effectively implement agreements. They would splinter, they would fragment, or they would ignore provisions. Secondly, much of the violence in the Central African Republic, at least during the years I was there, was not the result of fighting between the armed groups in the state. It was overwhelmingly related to economic predation or localized competition for power and resources. So and this, I think, is something that we're seeing in many conflicts, certainly in Eastern DRC, in South Sudan, in Darfur when I was there, and elsewhere. A large degree of the violence is driven by local dynamics of competition, predation, and revenge. And this matches very much the dynamics as described by researchers like Stefis Calvas and Lea Balcells on the distinction between civil war violence, violence resulting from clashes between belligerents, and violence in civil war, which, for the places where the United Nations has peacekeeping missions, is overwhelmingly more dominant. This led the mission to develop a strategy which focused on the reduction of violence against civilians and enabling broader political process, which included negotiations and military operations to limit violent economic predation. It included a lot of support for local agreements. At any given time in MONUSCO, we were supporting or leading between 15 and 20 different local peace processes. The difference from what Regina was saying, in which dialogue has always been seen as the tier 1 of POC strategies, is that dialogue and advocacy was mostly about missions and actors appealing to armed actors to stop attacking civilians. Whereas here, this was about local peace processes in which different communities, sometimes different armed actors, were seeking agreements in how to either manage conflict or come to agreements to better manage local tensions as a strategy for improving life in many ways, but first and foremost by reducing violence against civilians. The third was, of course, extension of state authority, which was a part of the mandate, but improvements in the state's both capacity and inclusivity. Starting from a very low bar, so outside of the capital, there was still very limited state presence, but if it was going to be sustainable, it was going to have to be a public administration, security sector, which was both inclusive, respectful of human rights, and present, which was one of the bigger challenges. And these elements were put in place alongside support for a national agreement, the efforts of which were led by the African Union. This approach is only possible when there are clear objectives set to the entire mission, and knowledge throughout the mission, particularly at the field offices, that's where a lot of the violence is happening, and effective mechanisms of coordination and follow-up. So we were blessed with a wonderful chief of staff, Vivian Van Peer, who put in a system by which objectives were set for each field office jointly with the military, police, and civilian components. And this was a process which was done jointly with the mission headquarters and the field office, but with all of the components there, and regular review and tracking of these objectives with a review of what support is necessary. And this is each time, sometimes if in a more rapidly changing field offices, this could happen every 2 weeks. In other places, it could happen once a month or once every 6 weeks, in which the military, the police, the civilian components review the objectives, what we're trying to do, through which tools, whether it's local agreements, whether it's military positioning, whether it's support for the deployment of local actors, together with, like I said, the 3 components and mission support. And by this you can track. We also had a human rights section, which was able to track fairly rapidly civilian deaths. So we could have a clearer sense. The greatest challenge, and I think this is, again, not only the case in Central African Republic, is the reality of large multidimensional missions. They're almost all involving belligerents which are weakly structured, incohesive, and fragmented, and most of them involved in violent economic predation. And this is extremely difficult to root out. It requires many activities beyond agreements, and very often requires, you can't have a reactive approach of saying, we see a violation here, we're going to go, because it's quite mobile. So you do need something of a strategic approach which analyzes the pattern and the systematic nature of violations and takes something fairly structural. For us, in some cases, it was removing a particular armed group from an urban area to lessen the extent by which they could conduct these activities, and then trying to bolster that with local agreements in communities. The danger, though, is that we continue to create false expectations in populations, because this moves around POC. Our strategy was very explicitly moving some of the violence away from high population density areas, but it doesn't eliminate that violence. And that's a much longer process. And we're seeing almost everywhere very unpopular peacekeeping missions. And part of that is the false expectations, which I think we can often create when we're far from the field about what can be achieved in very fragmented and violent environments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kenny, for those insights. I'd like to turn to Wendy next. And just as a reminder, in a minute, we're going to open the floor. So please do be thinking about what interventions you might like to make by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Wendy, turning to you, we've been alluding to this throughout our time this morning, but one of the key findings from the report is that POC is still often understood as a standalone technical activity, in spite of the fact that for years now, we've been talking about POC as a whole of mission activity. But this is still very pervasive. I guess maybe we could move beyond the why it's important to think about civilian protection as part of the mission strategic approach, but maybe, what are some of the things that we can do to try to change this way of thinking? We've talked a lot about the role of mission leadership. And then second, maybe if you can speak to some of the barriers that were identified between better linking POC and politics. Kenny spoke to some of the planning barriers and ideas, but also, the very real barrier when state actors are among the key perpetrators of violence, and how this creates tension between host state consent and diplomatic access. So a lot to throw at you, but if you can speak to a few of those points, that would be great.
Thanks so much, Jenna. Yeah, very easy questions. No, and thanks so much. Just to echo the other panelists in including me in such an enriching discussion on such an important topic, and really kudos to the author and to IPI in the Netherlands, who are real champions on POC issues, which we always appreciate. I mean, one, on the conceptual challenges, I know we've talked about this, but many people still really struggle to explain what we mean by political primacy. And I think it's one of the things that this report helps to clear up, right? It's become this sort of laundry basket where we sort of chuck in everything that falls under this basket of very complicated challenges in peacekeeping, when it's either, and then it becomes either this sort of very convenient foil when we sort of don't quite know how to sort of get around certain problems, especially some of these that have been raised already. but by doing so, it sort of loses all of its meaning. So I think we have to be clear about, what do we mean by it? How exactly does it drive decision-making on priorities? How does it drive resources? And then especially, what does it look like in practice? I want to talk about a few aspects of this, how the political aspects of the mission mandate is essential to POC in 3 areas. One, in the sort of joint strategic approach, which I think the paper does a really nice job in outlining. 2, in using good offices to create civic space in particular, and 3, on this issue that you raised around protecting civilians from threats from state actors. So one on sort of linking these 2 strategies, Regina really talked quite eloquently about how this can work in practice in terms of these 2 sorts of strategies informing each other ideally. I mean, we know it should be a whole of UN approach. This requires really pulling sort of POC into the bloodstream of a mission's political strategy and leadership priorities, as Kenny also outlined, and really guiding how much political capital the mission is willing to devote to these issues, and how to use its good offices functions especially to create civic space for civil society engagement. So, I mean, there has been, we know, some very good steps in integrating the work of, for example, political affairs and POC at the mission level. We've seen in our research, unfortunately, these can still be compartmentalized for different reasons. So jointly developed strategies are a really important start. I think we can also do more in terms of learning from lessons of the past few years, which are still quite salient. So one, I want to raise this from South Sudan, where Ralph will be familiar, and Regina too, but UNU CPR did some research a year or so back that looked at how the 2016 crisis in South Sudan, where there was a relapse of violence, especially that included these attacks on POC camps in Juba, really threw the mission into this crisis without having a political strategy, which really undermined the work of both the kind of civilian and the political affairs divisions, and their work with local partners, right? And the mission's leadership really distanced itself from some of the protagonists of that violence without a sort of political compass to navigate that. And it really had an effect on the ability, what became a limited ability of the mission to use its good offices function to really de-escalate some of the violence, the causes of that violence. That's something that the current SRSG has been great, I think, at paying quite a bit of attention to and sort of correcting for. But we can also see further upstream or earlier in a mission's timeline that those lessons can inform how senior leaders look for opportunities to advocate for POC in negotiation processes, as Kenny was saying, to really look for protection-related language in written agreements. Because if they aren't able to do so, and we admit it's not always a possibility, but it really misses a sort of key opportunity to introduce measures for accountability that can have really potentially long-lasting benefits. So it's certainly always worth the effort, we would say. They can also include measures for preventing conflict-related sexual violence, specifically, especially when that's one of the greatest causes of harm, as it is in many of our mission settings. It also means creating space during mediation efforts for more inclusive dialogue with conflict-affected communities. And then at the policy level, we think that there could be more. I think in our research shows that there can be always a little bit more attention paid to national POC policies and frameworks, which we realize is not always possible if there's a real lack of political will, and when the state itself is a protagonist of the violence. But in some settings, it's an SPM setting, but in Sudan, I think there's a really interesting example where the national POC policy, really sets POC as a national political priority. And we can see this potentially having a big difference in how state security forces likewise hold it as such. In the DRC, we saw that our research has shown that the mission has made really important efforts to link POC to the political negotiations and strategies, especially around its own transition planning. Last year, we had extensive consultations with the Congolese government on transition. When the mission had extensive negotiations with the government, MONUSCO did a really good job actually at advocating for the inclusion of POC-related benchmarks in the 2021 Joint Transition Plan. And that was only possible because of the political way the SRSG and the whole mission behind her was able to sort of champion. And it really, these are enormously important as it guides decisions on withdrawal. And while we know that the future of that plan is in question, given the recent turn of events in DRC, the initial inclusion of those POC benchmarks were only possible because of that mission advocacy. We know that the government was reticent about including them. Government officials told us specifically that the inclusion of POC was purely a result of mission advocacy and didn't represent necessarily the views of government actors who saw it language that was more focused on eliminating arms groups. So the fact that MINUSCO was able to find consensus with the government on the fact that POC should be a key factor in determining the benchmarks for a transition plan, we think offers a really important lesson for other missions. And including those benchmarks in Kinshasa through political dialogue with the government should also, should help prevent too rapid drawdown where possible from parts of Eastern Congo in particular, where the threats to civilians are the highest. And, our research has shown that base closures, obviously based on budgetary or political, any concerns that don't have to do with an evaluation of risks can obviously be devastating for civilians. And it really is one of the most important moments in a mission's life cycle where robust political engagement of POC is absolutely essential. Too very quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but on good offices, we think that it's really critical to link these political and protection aspects of the work of the mission. Creating civic space for CSOs is one concrete approach in which the political and protection functions of the mission can come together. CSOs represent conflict-affected communities that peacekeeping missions are mandated to protect. They have, tons of, besides being the right thing to do, as Regina mentioned, they provide really important analysis on the security situation that contribute to POC directly. They can help manage early warning networks. They can help facilitate dialogue between security forces and civilians. They can capitalize on sort of capacities of local actors to contribute to protection, especially important during transitions. And they can help missions earn the trust of civilians who sometimes might have limited awareness of the mission's mandate and its activities and plans. So yeah, just to say that PKOs, missions can prepare for potential resistance on including CSOs, but we feel like, and our research shows that they should always try to use their good offices to better advocate for CSO inclusion, and doing so can have a real knock-on effect in positive ways in terms of contributions, and that this aspect of localization is really important. That's always being done better at the field level. I mean, our research has shown that in the capital, so mission headquarters should really take a cue from how well this is happening at field offices, where components can be better integrated, where, as Regina was saying, they are more externally facing. I also think, missions can do better at creating space for humanitarian, human rights, and protection partners outside of the mission who have some really not only good kind of networks and practice that can be drawn on, but also really good guidance that isn't necessarily within the visibility of missions. And can do so by linking to protection clusters. OHCHR has some great guidance, and the SG guidance note on civic space is a really good one. Civic, is one of the NGOs had put out recently some guidance on civil society engagement into SSR practices, I think, that are useful. And then just extremely quickly, I know running out of time, the threats from state security actors, when they are among the key kind of perpetrators of violence against civilians in some of these contexts, we see that on the one hand, missions have faced the very difficult task of trying to, this paradox of trying to both protect civilians, but also strengthen state authorities who are often responsible for putting those civilians in danger. We know there's not simple solutions, but there are some really good opportunities that we've seen in our research where missions at both the national and the provincial level on host state security force compliance with international, can work to encourage host state security force compliance with international law, including, for example, in MINUSCO, there's the development of the Comité de Suivi, which has really mitigated potential violence by military and police by linking up with civil society leaders and government officials through including some of these early warning networks on the human rights due diligence policy, which is really important in communicating the parameters of that to government counterparts on what are the sort of conditions for joint operations with host state forces. On SSR efforts, we know that missions aren't always the best placed on that, but encouraging sort of better international law compliance is one area where the mission can at least help play a coordinating role. And so finally, maybe I'll just say, in New York, we also think that the Secretariat and UN and partners can really help bring some of these good practices from the missions, including civilian voices, to the Council's attention to inform their decision-making on that. So again, POC is a whole of mission responsibility. It's inherently linked to political engagement, lots of examples of good practice and lessons that we can draw from. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for that, Wendy. A lot of really good points there, several of which I'm hoping we can come back to. We have about a half an hour for Q&A time, so I do encourage you to put any questions you have in the chat. I know we have one that Lisa Charlin put in, and I'm glad she raised this because this was something else I wrote down that I was hoping we could get to today, which is really talking about how we understand this process in crowded spaces. So, increasingly UN is not always the lead actor in the political process. We also have crowded military spaces where there may be other member states and regional forces, mercenaries, all of these types of things that complicate this. Maybe thinking about Eastern Congo right now is a relevant example with the deployment of the East African Community Regional Force in Eastern Congo. Wendy, I believe Civic did some research on this a few years ago about talking about kind of the difficulties of protection when you have multinational forces deploying, because different actors have different understandings of their civilian protection obligations. And when you have a lot of actors deployed, it can be difficult to attribute perpetrators and violations have taken place and accountability and all of those types of things. So what role can the missions play, and what are, I guess maybe the challenges are obvious, but what are the entry points for missions to play when they're not the lead actor in the political process, and when there are other forces present that are conducting military operations and they may not be upholding their civilian protection obligations to the same extent? Can the UN serve as a standard bearer in some way? Can it help to hold accountable? Can it push for civilian harm mitigation? What are some of those different entry points that we see? Regina, maybe I can turn to you first, and then also to Wendy, because I know Civic has done some thinking on this in the past.
Sure, thanks, Jenna. I think you kind of rattled off a lot of the answers there at the end, but I'll just pick up on it. I think, this is something we've definitely been thinking about more and more. Again, not a new phenomenon, but one that's kind of increasing and changing in the context where we are over the last few years. And what Lisa references about the East African Regional Force in the DRC right now is different, like a different setting from, for example, looking at the situation of private military contractors or mercenaries or whatever we are calling them, other security personnel in these settings. So these different, each context will be different about how what capacities the mission has to respond and what role the mission has to respond. And so the first thing I would say, and it's something we're very conscious of in the DRC context right now, is that the mission does have to some extent take its cues from the council and from the mandate. And that's something we're watching for this mandate renewal of the DRC. Colleagues on the ground, of course, they have questions. They have questions about what they should do, what they can do, and how, before they even get to how to do it. So we need political guidance from the council and the states on what the role of peacekeeping is going to be in those different settings. Then when we have that guidance, or even as just sort of a base, I would say that at minimum what we need is coordination to start with. We need deconfliction. We need to protect our own peacekeepers and to ensure that our operations we are conducting are going to be effective and everything. We need that basic coordination. Where it goes beyond that to support or cooperation, and again, where we have that mandate and that role and it's appropriate, we have the HRDDP as a clear starting point that needs to be utilized in a way that, we've all been talking about the HRDDP and its implementation for years, but in a way that is, a force for good, a force for change, a force for influencing those partners, if we're at the stage of partnering, to ensure protection of civilians. And then I think a couple other things are, what we can do, again, no matter the circumstances, is training or capacity building of these forces to support them with IHL, with international human rights, etc. whether we're the best actor for that will depend again on the setting. There are others, of course, in this space, but that's always an option, in an important one, depending if those actors are willing to receive that and engage. And then monitoring, as you mentioned. In all of these missions, we have clear and strong human rights mandates to monitor and report, and it should not be relevant who the actors are who may be committing human rights violations or harm to civilians. We should monitor that situation. And then, of course, what we do with that information depends again on our avenues for influence, whether we can engage those actors as some sort of partner or at least let's say well-intentioned actor who is interested in not harming civilians. If we can engage them and do sort of advocacy with them, but of course we have other avenues for bringing our human rights monitoring and reporting to light if necessary. So I think those are all, again, basic things that commissions do already that are particularly critical in these situations of parallel forces and crowded fields, if you will.
Thanks, Regina. Wendy, anything that you want to add on top of that?
Yeah, so first of all, completely echo the points that that Regina has just made. I think, very specifically, it's these two areas. One, I think the council, especially in the context of MINUSCO's mandate renewal, which is happening now, can respond to the East Africa Community Force deployment in its new mandate by, one, setting some minimum standards of what, that MINUSCO should and can establish some information sharing mechanisms, which would hold sort of both parties sort of accountable to, basic deconfliction of their operations, especially given, this very crowded field and the precedent we've seen from previous operations, non-MINUSCO, non-FARDC, but partnered operations. There's certainly justified concern there for potential risks to civilians from these bilateral operations or separate multilateral operations. And the second is to ask, encourage the ERCF to comply with international law and really undertake efforts to mitigate harm to civilians through its presence in operations, including through, as Regina was saying, civilian harm analysis and tracking. And there is precedent for the council doing this. G5 Sahel is one example. The other is the CTARC in Somalia, which is the civilian casualty tracking and analysis and response cell, which are really good examples of how the UN host state sort of forces and regional forces can work together, these sort of mechanisms to share information. And I think separate from the regional force issue, I think there's maybe a third area, and that would be, the council can also condemn regional or external support to armed groups in the country, which is not a small matter, and one that that has the potential to destabilize all of the efforts for peace consolidation to date.
Thanks so much for that. I'm actually going to we're going to give the floor to Evan St. Mars, who has an intervention. So Evan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jenna. I hope you can hear me all right. And thank you to IPI for convening this meeting, and congrats to you and to Ralph for publishing the report. I think it definitely adds to this ongoing discussion, as everyone's noted, over several years about the primacy of politics and the protection of civilians and peacekeeping. And I just want to echo Ambassador Zellenrath from the Netherlands that I think it's going to be helpful for a couple of reasons. First and foremost in the C-34, where we are approaching negotiations. This year, unfortunately, the C-34 wasn't able to reach consensus on its report, but in the working group, at least, we did reach consensus on some quite, topical relevant language on this issue, where for the first time we were able to agree, again, without the consensus adoption of the report, that the mandates of protection of civilians and support and engagement on political processes are mutually reinforcing. And this was the first time that the C-34 had come to that agreement. Again, the report wasn't adopted, but I think we have a solid foundation now within the C-34 to continue these discussions. And not necessarily that peacekeeping missions or peace operations are burning to read the C-34 report every year, but I do think this kind of guidance at the political level can be helpful. And if the C-34 is recognizing this, I think it's useful. Second, I think it could also be helpful to Security Council colleagues. I think everyone's cognizant of not micromanaging peacekeeping missions, but if there's clearer guidance and mandates, and I think the paper sets this out in terms of the links between POC and the political, I think that would be useful. I've got a question just in relation to something that really struck me in this paper and in the comments from all of you, and particularly from Kenny as well, of the importance of the deeper connections that are needed between headquarters in New York, mission headquarters, sector headquarters, and field offices, and particularly the linchpin role that field offices can play or should play in making these links. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the kind of resources that are needed to do this work at the field office level. Do missions have the resources they need on things like strategic planning, analysis, coordination, for example, and what gaps need to be closed, but also what are some of the administrative or bureaucratic kind of hurdles that need to be addressed to unlock this work in connecting mission headquarters with field offices to enable the work at the local level. So 2 easy questions for you all, but thanks for this opportunity and really appreciated the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Evan. Kenny, over to you to address Evan's question.
No, very good to see you, Evan, again. I think the last time was in Bongi. On the question of the integration between mission headquarters and field offices, I do think it's essential. I think the biggest obstacle is not bureaucratic. It's conceptual. There remains a sense, partly that the primacy of politics, as well as the desires of different headquarters, are the attainment of a national agreement. And very often that is the focus of senior leadership, and then the mission is left to run itself. Field offices are in some ways abandoned and just avoid any scandals, and that's not using the field offices strategically. The second reason that's already there is a misconception about how conflict works. So very many people think that local conflicts are just silliness, unserious politics, and that the real serious politics is at the national level, and that all local conflict is just poor innocent farmers being manipulated by evil warlords in the center. And that's a very deep misunderstanding about how societies work. If you look at South Sudan, local conflicts, which can be extremely violent, local competition for pasture land is a life or death issue for communities. They will fight extremely hard about it, and they often manipulate the center to gain benefits in their local conflict. So there's definitely manipulations from the center, but there's manipulation from the bottom as well. And until you can look at until you can analyze the relationship between local conflicts and national conflicts, you're very poorly placed to do about it. So I think once you start to see, one, that much of the violence is not coming from the national conflict, or what Kalibas calls the master cleavage in a conflict, it is coming from a series of local competition and predation and so on. Then you can start working with your field offices strategically about how you're going to face that challenge. And that's simply a step which many missions don't really take. And I think that's really the point of Severino Tessier's book about the Eastern Congo. The trouble with the Congo is the disconnect between the thinking of multilateral institutions about national politics and the lack of, you could say, serious treatment of local conflicts role in that. The only things that I think were really needed much more is greater flexibility on, you could say, the mission support side, or which not greater flexibility, greater resources. For example, in order to respond rapidly to local conflict, we often needed FPUs. We didn't have enough FPUs, so we would split FPUs. But FPUs come with one set of self-sustainment, not two. So for cooking and washing and so on, the FPUs find it very difficult to split themselves so that you could have half an FPU patrolling in one area and half an FPU patrolling in other areas. This denies the mission very often flexibility. Like I was saying earlier, violence against civilians is quite mobile, especially where it's based on economic predation. They don't do these things right in front of a base. You need to be able to understand the dynamics, what's important, which pasture land, which market roads, which access roads, which transhumance roads, so that you can start dealing with that strategically. And that often requires a much more mobile ability for civilians and for military and police than the mission often has.
Thank you, Kenny. Thanks for addressing that. And certainly, I think probably all of us here and on the panel would agree with you on the importance of the local political piece. And that, you know, as we've mentioned, is something that Ralph and I really tried to push forward in this report, is expanding beyond the political. And Kenny, excuse me, I think even picking up on something that you said earlier is also not just the formal written processes, but the informal processes, because it's not always just about signing an agreement. It's also about a much larger kind of whole of life question for a lot of these individuals. When we think about mission leaders being predominantly focused on the national level written agreement, you know, this is probably not something that is only generating from an SRSG, but also something that is coming down from council members, from member states, etc. You know, what else do we need? You know, the report itself is focused very much on the mission level, but if we can expand this conversation now a bit higher than that, what else is needed from the council, from member states, from others to encourage this conceptual shift that you're speaking of? Kenny, maybe I can go back to you first, and then also to hear from the other panelists.
Sure. I do think that there needs to be a greater understanding in at least the kind of places where UN peacekeeping operations and many special political missions are sent, that where you're dealing with largely incohesive, unstructured actors, weakly structured actors, agreements don't provide a rapid path. It's a fantasy. And yet the international community, this is not just the council, it's much broader than that, repeatedly insisted on signing agreements with actors that they knew were in some ways far too weak to implement these agreements. So I do think that in some ways, starting with capitals and the council, where you do have parties which are weakly structured and incohesive, you need to be thinking of different approaches, and that requires having strong field offices, because in a traditional ceasefire, for example, you're relying on the internal structure of the belligerents to enforce compliance. And that works when you're dealing with a strong, coherent actor. But this is mediation coming from the history of interstate conflict. And now we're not dealing with actors who have the same attributes, and that has to be adapted. And that will require longer term investment in all of the corollary approaches, that we've talked to and that your report covers. And longer time frame. There are no shortcuts, and some of that investment will need to be in some of the state building work, which seems to be looked down upon now. I think in Central African Republic, the low barrier to entry for rebellion, meaning that it's very easy to create a new armed group. It's very cheap to create a new armed group. That creates a situation in which you're going to have constant challenges, armed contestation of the state. And these are the kind of investments in state capacity which have to be accompanied by ensuring that they're respectable of populations and that they're inclusive. But without that, we're going to be dealing with a chronically violent hinterland, which will destabilize politics everywhere, and the consequences for violence against civilians that we've seen in Central African Republic for the last decade.
Thanks for that. Anything else from the other panelists? And Ralph, feel free to jump in as well. And then I have another question I'm hoping to pose to Regina following this. No? Okay, Regina, I wanted to ask and dig a little bit more on some of the potential tensions that have been felt between POC and politics when we are dealing with state perpetrators, because this seems to be something that we're dealing with in multiple settings now. When we conducted interviews, it was something that was repeatedly referred to by mission personnel as what they saw as one of the key tensions. I know you have a background in human rights as well, so can you help us understand a little bit about the difference between accountability and maybe some reference for HRDDP, but also the need to maintain diplomatic channels? This was a tension I think we saw in South Sudan. Can you talk a little bit about this tension and how you see that being managed appropriately?
Sure, thanks, Jenna. Not an easy one, and one that's very difficult in practice, of course, for those who who do remain in situ and have to, have these relationships. I mean, not only to implement their mandates, but frankly to stay safe and to stay alive and functioning. I would say that it's all in the details, and it's sort of in the middle. I don't think it can be a tension. It does not need to be a tension if managed very delicately, and carefully. Because for one thing, we say state actors. The state is not a monolith, and there are all types of actors within the state. So it's about finding those who are allies, who are powerful, those outside the state who can influence, those within the state. It's about really understanding the breadth of actors you have to engage with. And then, when it is about those who are bad actors, who are committing, say, violence against civilians, and this is something that's very clear in the HRDDP, it's about, narrowing to focus on those, to look at a unit level, for example, in the HRDDP, or those specific circumstances. And so it's not, painting with a broad brush that the entire government or the entire state is the problem. If we do that, yes, we will be lost. Then we might as well pack up and go if we see no potential entry points. But that does require, a nuanced understanding of the actors and of the context, the power balances, etc. So I would start with that. And then I would say, again, as HRDDP's intention is, but again, difficult to implement, but the intention is to leverage engagement with state actors to improve behavior. It's not about just closing the door and rejecting that support. It should be a tool to enable support. And that's what I've seen in the field when we've been implementing that. That is often a challenge of communication. It's how that is explained. It's not about whether, or it's about how it's explained to our partners, and it's also about the mitigating measures that are developed. Because again, it's not a yes or no, we will provide the support or we won't. It's about what will we do as we provide the support to ensure less harm to civilians. So I think that as with everything, strategic communications is important for peacekeeping, and something where there's a lot of emphasis on right now that we could do better on. And then that being said, there is a time when we need to speak out, where the UN needs to speak out. And I think I'll just come back to leadership, because I really think that's who does this well when they do it well. We have had mission leaders who we should learn from those examples, who can maintain that relationship while also speaking out when we need to on harm against civilians. And if you do that consistently, in an impartial manner, backed up by evidence, and strong support, then I think it will land better and will not necessarily blow up the whole relationship with the host government. And so again, that's something that takes time. It has to be done well over time. It's not a one-off. And where mission leaders are not in a place to do it, I think Ralph mentioned, there are a lot of other actors in the UN system who can be called upon to play that role. And we need to see those as mutually reinforcing roles, not competing, or, as if OHCHR, the High Commissioner, says something that creates a problem for the mission, but it should be, a coordinated approach of the different offices and leaders within the system on protection issues.
Thanks, Regina. Maybe one more question I have, which I'm going to pose to Wendy, and then I'm going to come around for maybe some last remarks from everyone, including you, Ralph, so that you're prepared. Wendy, you mentioned a bit about written agreements and national frameworks. This is something we also recommend in the report. And of course, putting protection language in a written agreement is not a guarantee, but it can serve as an entry point for accountability. So can you talk a little bit about how that works? And also you mentioned national level policies and frameworks. Without pretending that these types of documents will solve all protection related problems, how do you see them as serving as entry points, and how have they been used effectively?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's one of the things that that we have found that missions don't always sort of leverage the opportunity to do. I mean, I sort of gave the caveat earlier that we recognize that if there's not political space there or political will to do it, there's not, in which case we don't want to, there's no point to an empty framework that has no viability for implementation. But where there is potentially opportunity and one can get at least some steps toward those framework and some protection language in these national frameworks, we have seen in lots of different settings how it really does make a difference. And here we draw, at least Civic draws on experience that we have in working quite closely at the policy level, with the executive leadership in the government, but also at the operational level with state security forces, where the development, for example, of a sort of political policy can have an immediate sort of knock-on effect in terms of sending a very clear political signal to the state security apparatus that POC is a priority and they are to develop, accordingly, SOPs, CIVCAS tracking mechanisms, et cetera. All of the sort of tools and mechanisms that makes that policy come to life and makes it operational. And here we've got actually very good examples from Afghanistan, pre-Taliban, from Ukraine, pre-Russian invasion, in Niger. There's some really good work happening now. So there's lots of contexts that aren't always in mission settings. And here, I just reiterate the point that by sort of connecting with colleagues, across our sort of institutional divides, we can actually grab some of these examples and really look at what we can learn from them in different settings, and obviously contextualize them. But yeah, they very much so. Protection language, really can be an entry point to entire state security forces, adopting in really quite meaningful ways POC as a priority, including sort of all of the various mechanisms that makes it viable in practice.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And now I'm going to turn to each of our panelists just for maybe 2 minutes of closing remarks on anything that you think warrants emphasizing one more time. We've heard a lot of really good recommendations and feedback, and thanks for all that. Maybe Ralph, I'll turn to you first.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jenna. I guess, just summing up, listening to some of the great answers we had to those questions, I can imagine, if you're in the audience, that it can feel overwhelming, that the issues are so complex, some of them are so intractable, and to just emphasize that, like politics, protecting civilians is very much the art of the possible. And, the more that you can identify wherever it is you're working, if it's at headquarters, if it's in a mission, if it's in a remote field office, what the protection challenges are, what your presence there can do to help solve them. Hopefully you're also getting some direction from your supervisors around where you fit into that bigger strategic picture. Because to come back to the importance of the local level, also, creating those, I think the Security Council will care about these things if they have the right narrative, if they understand how a field office fits into the political and the promises for peace and the conflict dynamics of a given country, and thinking about MONUSCO and the East African Force right now. I think it's really tricky. That is absolutely a situation in which, there are member states involved. And, I was in Regina's chair the last time the M23 was causing trouble. We thought they were gone. But, there are large forces out there. And some of that is going to be beyond the mission's, capacity to address directly. But there is going to be an important role, as Regina emphasized, around, principled positions around human rights, making sure that, the mission is not stepping back from those roles, and, conveying explicitly or behind closed doors, the challenges that will likely be faced. So let me end there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ralph. Regina, over to you for any last comments.
Thanks. I just want to pick up, on this issue of how things work at the field office level, and really to say, as I mentioned, I think we could look more at that and what's working, and try to see. It won't all be transferable to headquarters, but to get to also Evan's question about resourcing at the field office level. While we could always use more of everything, I would almost say, it's important to look at what's going right. And there have been developments over the last years on things like integrated JOCs and JMACs at field office level. They're called different things in different missions that I think have improved this. And also for POC officers, there's movement towards getting them more out to field offices. We had that already in a couple missions. It's appreciated by heads of field offices to have that advisory support, especially where they're really implementing their own strategies, because every field office is different. And for example, MINUSCA just recently deployed, they had their team all in Bangui for the last many years and have recently deployed their POC officers to field offices. So I think that's an important development, and it's important to just look at these things that are working and what resources are more needed at field office level. And I think, as Kenny mentioned, it's an interesting, the role of the chief of staff in doing that linking between field office and headquarters. And sometimes the chief of staff role can be quite amorphous. And so, maybe this is an area where we can say, okay, they can have a real impact, an important substantive impact, and one to sort of further enhance. I'll just leave it there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Regina. Kenny?
Just a couple of small points. One, at least in the Central African Republic, in terms of following up about violations by state actors, what made things easier was its periodicity. We had a monthly report that went to the Minister of Defense and the Minister of the Interior on all of the violations that we had identified, grave and not so grave, illegal checkpoint collecting illegal taxes that we would include, with recommendations about follow-ups. And it was a regular event. So because it was every month we would be submitting these lists of, which sometimes were very long because we were trying to be comprehensive. It becomes a regular process of collaboration rather than which they expect and which they work around. And I think that made a lot of the collaboration easier. I fully agree with the report's recommendation that we should try to get POC language in agreements. But I am skeptical because in my experience in negotiations, whether it be in Yemen or in Eastern Congo or elsewhere, I found most groups very happy, put in whatever protection language you want. They know it, they don't take it seriously. And that is corrosive in how so many agreements have language. I think what's more important, and Wendy mentioned it in one of her interventions earlier, putting in place not just the language, but the mechanisms. Where you have good language on the protection on child soldiers or gender-based violence, if you don't have mechanisms, it's to follow it up with most of these groups, that means it's not taken seriously at all. So getting the language in there is good, even if it's not going to have an impact, because I think it is a symbolic message to the population. So it's not something that you should not do. But what's going to be more important in actually changing things is having some kind of mechanisms which can involve community input or input of victims, which can work to bring it to life. And then just lastly, on the working with field offices, the what I found in work with different missions to be the most important, a lot of field officers work very well, but so many of them didn't know where they fit into a national mission strategy. And so then sometimes you have a lot of good work, sometimes you have less good work, but the lack of their connection to a national vision of what the mission is trying to achieve in terms of a theory of change, I think that is going to be one of the more important elements in how missions deal with field officers, which I do think in these contexts is going to need to play a larger and larger role.
Thank you so much, Kenny. Wendy, last word over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very quickly. Yeah, I think whether it comes to engaging with national authorities to ensure that POC is included, for example, in a benchmark in transition settings, what we talked about earlier, whether it's local military and police commanders sort of engaging with them to making sure that they understand that UN support is contingent on compliance with international law, resourcing needed POC capacities, and happy to talk more about that on another occasion, or really strengthening civil society so that they can really concretely contribute to protection, really creating a space for them to do that, are ways that really both the civilian and the political engagement are really central to these aspects of peacekeeping work. And just, final word, just that ensuring that partnerships across the breadth of the UN system, but also beyond it, are really central to those efforts. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Wendy. And maybe this is a great moment to just sort of highlight that our next step of research at IPI on some of this is precisely going to be looking at what the primacy of politics means at the local level and how missions are doing this, how they can connect local level political strategies with the national level strategy and across field mission offices. And in addition to that, really highlighting the work that civil affairs have been doing at the local level, because there's a lot of excellent work that has been going on, as we've referenced, and there are ways to draw lessons from that work. So stay tuned to IPI for all of that. Please do check out the report, which is available at the IPI website. I want to thank all of our panelists, and of course, a very big thank you to the Kingdom of the Netherlands for their continued support, not only of the A4P+ project here at IPI, but of being champions of the protection of civilians. So thanks to everyone for being here, and have a great day.